Hello there. We were told at the start of this year's election period that it could be the most disrupted election in recorded history. So this week we're going to be exploring that on the public gallery. At the start of this year's election period, politicians were warned to expect disruptions. And that's because over the last few years, we've seen the vocal minority get a lot more vocal and a little bit less of a minority in their attitudes towards politicians and politics, mimicking a lot of what we've seen from countries like the United States and importing a lot of that rhetoric, which in some cases can be downright dangerous. We can look at something like what happened in the US on January 6th when President Biden was sworn in and see parallels to what happened here in February of that year with the protests in Wellington as an example. This year we also have 8 freedom groups vying for a vote within that sphere, and those groups are loud and angry and full of angst and known to be disruptive. And all you have to do is look at how they've behaved at other events around the country in the last 18 months to sort of see what you're going to be expecting or what we were expecting in terms of disruptions to campaigns. And in the lead up to this year's election campaign, we've actually seen events where candidates like Hamilton East's Ryan Hamilton going to meetings with sovereign citizens and trying to placate them by saying he was one of them. This was a group that at the same event issued execution warrants to sitting city councillors. And that kind of disruption is really, really concerning. But at the same time, disruption in an election campaign is kind of to be expected in some places. There's the idea of peaceful protest, which is a right given to all New Zealanders. And at the same time, we expect some sort of disruption around billboards and signs and graffiti. And while it's certainly never ideal for that sort of thing to happen, it is expected from the campaigns. In this week's episode of the Public Gallery, I really wanted to look at just how disruptive the campaigns have been. We're now less than a month out from this year's general election, and we're seeing a lot of noise from certain parties, certain groups, and certain individuals. I've been on the receiving end of that myself, and it's really fascinating to see how our candidates are pulling off trying to run an election in this environment and what they're putting into place, as well as what voters are thinking. So, for this week's episode, I'm joined by 2 guests. One is Scout, our regular, who's an activist themselves. They've been to protests, they've gone out and supported causes that are important to them. They're one of the people who would sign up and sing Waiata while Julian Batchelor is screaming about anti co governance. But I've also got the campaign manager for the Hamilton East Labour campaign for Georgie Dansey. Holly Snape, who's been running the campaign this year, is in charge of organising pretty much the whole thing. And I sit down and have a talk to her about what the campaign has to do to prepare for this, just how disruptive things have been during the campaign, and where this all seems to be leading, and the risks of this kind of campaign happening, this sort of disruption happening to our political process. So let's start off with a really simple, fun analogy about disruption, because one of the things that's really important to note about any kind of disruption is that there's underlying meanings. And a great example of that actually popped up during the week with the ACT Party. A David Seymour ACT billboard was completely covered in what would be classed as graffiti, but is actually really artistic and beautifully done, a rendition of David Seymour as Ken from the Barbie movie. And it's certainly an interesting analogy because the Barbie movie is a global phenomenal success, and Ken as a character is remarkably similar to David Seymour in a number of ways. But I tell you what, I'm going to let Scout describe this because they nail it. It's absolutely brilliant. But it shows you some of the nuance that comes into how disruption can work and whether or not it's effective disruption or disruption for the sake of disruption.
It's absolutely a really unique way of disruption, and it's a really clever social. I don't know if they intended it this way, but it's a really clever social commentary because here he comes out saying he embraces it, and he thinks it's flattering, and he thinks it's a compliment on his looks. And no one who looks at David Seymour can say that he looks anywhere close as good as Ryan Gosling. But the thing is, the Barbie movie framed Ken as the leader who had absolutely no substance. His profession was beach. And he, as a leader, he stood for like soft rock and horses. And there was absolutely no substance about it. And he got all of these Barbies who were in high flying careers like surgeon and astronaut and president. And he made them into his like housewives and into housewives for all the other Kens. And I think it says a lot that the leader of the ACT Party, which has a lot of policies that would essentially make a lot of women housewives, is saying that he embraces this comparison when it's not a flattering comparison at all. I know it's really easy for a lot of people to see the color pink and go, it's anti feminist, or to see the name Barbie and go, it's anti feminist. But actually, that was a really cleverly done way of, it was a really cleverly done portrayal of a lot of feminist values and feminist critique on our society and the way that it works. And so I just think it's really apt that the leader of this party, who's going to pull women's rights back into the 50s, is flattered to be compared to Ken from the Barbie movie.
Unfortunately, most disruptions that we see during election campaigns are not going to be artistically rendered and beautifully described with a number of nuances, like having David Seymour as Ken on a very pretty picture. There is a lot of other disruptions out there that include everything from protests all the way through to graffiti on signs and candidate meetings that can go awry. And we've already kind of seen that happen in some places. We know, for instance, that Voices for Freedom, a disinformation spreading group that were heavily involved in Wellington's protests last year, that they've actually put out a list of 11 points for their members to use to go and disrupt election meetings. At the same time, Kirikiriroa Hamilton had an election meeting sort of this year earlier held by sovereign citizens where they issued execution writs for some councillors, but not for one councillor in particular, Ryan Hamilton, who's now the National Party candidate for that seat. And, well, that was certainly an interesting experience, but the city councillors involved in this have actually met with the candidates who are running for the election across the political spectrum to warn them about these sort of meetings and give them advice on how to tell when something's not quite right or when it's time to leave. This week alone, we've already seen a death threat against Green Party list candidate Efeso Collins, who's a former Auckland mayoral candidate as well. The complaint was so serious that the police were told about it before Efeso was told about it. That's really, really concerning. I sat down and spoke to Holly Snape. She's the campaign manager for Hamilton East Labour Party candidate Georgie Dansey. And I asked her, how much warning were you given about this? What was the advice that came from Labour Party head office for candidates and how to deal with the potential for disruption during an election period?
So we have been talking about this right from pre the electioning period. Once the campaign managers were identified, we have very regular meetings with Central Hub, which is the campaign headquarters of the Labour Party. And these were the very first conversations we were having were around safety and potential for difficult situations, making sure candidates were well looked after. There was a lot of advice around what candidates should and shouldn't do. Certainly, door knocking and even attending events alone, we've been discouraged seriously from doing that at all. And in all honesty, previous elections as well, I've tended to be involved with women candidates. This is an issue that as women we're generally very conscious of. So in previous elections we've taken the same approach. We tend to make sure that our candidates are well supported and have people around them wherever they are. So in that sense, is it different? Probably not, except that the central campaigning, the advice we're getting is very much around ensuring that your candidate is safe. We haven't necessarily had those kinds of conversations before. It was more about making sure you weren't entering a property with a dog where your candidate might get bitten. That was where the fear was before. this time round, we're absolutely seeing concern around some people who have become really elevated, probably emboldened to some degree, to be a lot more aggressive around ideology. And we haven't really seen that in previous campaigns.
One of the other more dynamic factors that comes into this year's election is the number of third parties that are actually involved in trying to get you to change the way that you vote. This is supposed to be a really transparent process. Anybody who's spending more than $15,000 on any sort of campaign to influence voting is meant to register with the Electoral Commission, for example, as a third party promoter. And there's a number of organisations on that list that probably wouldn't surprise you, like the Council of Trade Unions or the Taxpayers Union. Then there's some that might surprise you a little bit, like Forest and Bird, for example. They all intend to spend a certain amount of money to try and get people to influence the way that they vote. One of the more contentious one of those has been really fascinating to sit down and watch, though, because he claimed initially that he wasn't trying to encourage people to vote a certain way, and that's Julian Batchelor. Now, Julian has been up and down the country with his anti-co-governance tours, and at almost every stop he's been to, he's been met by very loud protests from Tangata Whenua and Tō Iwi supporting the idea of co-governance and it being tied into how Te Tiriti works and what that means for the country. Scout has actually been actively involved in a couple of those protests already. But what's really fascinating about this and how it fits into electioneering is that while Batchelor himself said he was not going out of his way to tell people how to vote, his printed documents very specifically tell people which parties not to vote for. He was put under investigation by the Electoral Commission and that was referred to the police, where, up until the point where he paid to be seen as a third party promoter, he denied that that was what he was actually doing, which means that we've got examples of outside influences and how our election works that also causes disruption and are disruptive themselves. But the argument then pops up is, how do we decide what's a good disruption versus a bad disruption? How is a protest against co-governance any different to a number of conspiracy theorists standing up at a Meet the Candidates event and starting to corner them there for things like mandates that no longer exist? Scout's got a really interesting perspective on this, and it's something that Holly also echoes, but
Certainly,
we'll start with Scout
we're
around
not having as
those sort of
many
differences
terrible
that are
experiences on
there
the
in
doors as I
between,
would have
I guess you
expected.
could call them
And
good
actually, that
and
says
bad
something. That
disruptions.
actually says
What
what we
people
probably all know
need to
is
really
that
look at
these
when
people
they're
are
looking
few
at a
and far
campaign
between, right?
is what the values
Like
behind
these
the
are a
campaign is.
small
If the
minority of
values
individuals who make a
are
lot of noise
in
and get a
line with
lot
your
of
values,
attention.
then it's
So we're not
a
seeing it so
campaign
much in the doors
that
because it's
that matches
unlikely
you.
you're
Not
gonna
everyone
come
has the
across
same
someone like
values.
that. Where we
People
are
all
seeing
think
them is,
different things.
at events, in those sort of
Personally, what I
places,
look for
and that makes
is
some sense because that's when they can
campaigns that
come together, and we know they're
really
more emboldened as well when they are in groups,
prioritize
and it's
Māori
where they are
voices
more likely to
and
get
are
media
really
attention.
determined that they're going to
Yeah, I
um,
think they egg each other on in
uphold
those
the mana of
situations
Te
as
Tiriti o
well.
Waitangi.
That kind of pack
So
mentality to
I
some
keep an eye
degree.
out for that.
So,
I
that's
listen
where we're
for
having, I suppose, interactions, but
little
probably not as many as
signals,
I would have
little
anticipated.
virtue signals in what campaigners are saying. There are some little points, like, for instance, a feminist activist might be saying, I support the rights of women and girls. But that has become a dog whistle. That is something that usually it's a trans exclusive campaign if that is being said. Um, so it takes a lot of social awareness and it takes a lot of paying attention, and it can be really hard to know. But once you stop and you are able to have those interactions or those conversations, it is much easier um, to be able to tell if a campaign is something that does match your values. The thing is, no activism has ever been successful without being disruptive in some way. So, as much as we on the left are using strategies like playing really loud music outside Julian Batchelor's meetings, or strategies like, going across the road and having a much better, much more fun party, away from whichever group we have an issue with. Things like the Parliament protest, for instance, were designed to be disruptive as well, and they were successfully disruptive. They met their goal. If their goal was disruption anyway, they met their goal. They instigated a national conversation about what they were doing. And while I do think there are limits to what is socially acceptable, we all have the right to protest, and we all have the right to disrupt as much as we need to in order to be heard, even if we look down on some groups more than others.
I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? And I've been an agitator. I've attended my fair share of protests and the likes, and I think they are just a part of democracy, and they're a part of communities having a say. So I don't have an issue with disruption. I don't have an issue with people calling out chants in areas and things. I think that is a part of the way that we protest generally. I think disruption becomes problematic when individuals are targeted and people aren't safe. I think that is quite a different kettle of fish when people are physically targeting individuals, and it's particularly difficult in that women of colour, women and women of colour are the most likely to be targeted, and of course that's our candidate. Like, we know we're not going to change these people's minds. Those people out there, absolutely on a picket line, disrupting, looking at ways to interfere or intervene. Those are not individuals that you can have constructive conversations with. They're not going to come along on a journey with you. You're not going to get to a point where you agree to disagree, because I don't mind that as well. I'm quite happy to have a political conversation with somebody with a different political standpoint. You and I both come from families where that's every Christmas, isn't it? Yeah. So, that's not an issue at all. But these people are not interested in having those conversations, and the difficulty with that disruption is it's not. I struggle to find the purpose, what it is they're actually wanting to achieve, other than to intimidate or to harm people.
So while campaigns might have been prepping for what they could do to keep their candidates safe, our MPs who were already in Parliament were kind of not doing that. Right from the beginning of the year, James Shaw, leader of the Green Party, or co-leader of the Green Party, has been arguing really specifically around protections for MPs during the campaign. He himself was the victim of an assault because of his stance in Parliament from somebody who held conspiracy theory beliefs who ended up at the Wellington protest. He has a very vested interest in this. But the parliamentarians involved across the parties did not talk about this until about a week before Parliament rose for the last time, just before the election period officially kicked off. And that's really concerning. Yes, MPs have a really busy life, but it's about making sure that people are safe, and not just elected MPs. Everybody else who is running in a campaign, who is involved in the election process, even those people who want to go out and meet their candidates should be able to do so in an environment that's safe. But that didn't happen so much this year until the very, very last minute.
The risk is much more than it ever was. I have personally known MPs who have had threats. I've personally watched it happen. There are some really cooked people out there, and they do unfortunately disrupt in a really unproductive way. There's no message about it. The values are often really incoherent. And if your disruption is actively hurting people, then that's not going to achieve anything. That's going to alienate people. So there is some legitimate risk, and I'm surprised that it wasn't fully discussed until the week before Parliament closed, because we'd seen incidents of this repeatedly up in the last couple of terms of Parliament. We've seen MPs be assaulted on the street walking back from work. We've seen massive coordinated amounts of death threats and just vile harassment being directed at a lot of our MPs. We've seen a record number of Wahine Māori MPs being basically bullied out, and they were experiencing exactly that same vitriol from a lot of members of the community and a lot of members of the public. And so I'm really surprised that it took that long for that conversation to happen around the election campaign and the risks. I feel like it should probably have happened sooner.
One of the reasons why this is so disappointing about MPs leaving this to the last minute is because, well, we knew it was coming. There have been reports consistently since before the Wellington protest around the amount of vitriolic messaging out in public spheres and social media spaces that were coming really specifically from those groups pushing misinformation and disinformation around vaccines and mandates and that entire conspiratorial network that was really driven towards Wellington for the protest. Those kind of hateful messages, death threats, and violence that were aimed at politicians, particularly Māori MPs, particularly women, and particularly Dame Jacinda Ardern, is really concerning. A report that was done this year, though, by the Office of the Prime Minister and Cabinet showcased that they're willing to make sure that the ends justify the means. 1 in 4 people who believe in these conspiratorial viewpoints felt that violence was justified to make a point. And that's really a scary thought. Now, the number of people who actually hold these views, that's a lot harder to ascertain. But the fact that it's 1 in 4 of them, that's kind of a scary number. And Scout has an idea as to why there are people out there like this, like who feel that they need to do this kind of threat or resort to that kind of violence to get their point across.
A lot of our politicians don't represent us. They don't have the lived experience that we have. They don't have the experience of living under the poverty line. There are definitely some, golden children in the bunch, but it's not universal. And so we look at these campaigns with these faces who don't experience the hardships that we experience on a daily basis. And it feels really alienating.
While it's nowhere near as scary sounding as public meetings with somebody there who's a conspiracy theorist who holds the ideals that violence begets the means to get their message across, there are other ways of being able to disrupt an election campaign out there. And one of them is actually something that seems relatively common and mostly harmless, but really isn't. And that's actually defacing billboards. We see billboards everywhere this time of year because it's an election period, and graffiti is very much a stock standard issue when it comes to these billboards. But this year, we're actually seeing 2 really scary trends come through. There is not a single Te Pāti Māori candidate who is running in this year's election who has not had to clean off the N-word from at least one of their signs. And that harks back to a lot of the race baiting that we're seeing from a third-party promoter like Julian Batchelor, all the way through to the race baiting that we're seeing through from organisations like Christopher Luxon's National Party, where he ruled out working with Te Pāti Māori. On the other end of the spectrum, we're seeing a whole bunch of political party billboards being defaced with really coordinated messages. In the area that I live in, for example, every single billboard from National, Labour, ACT, Greens and Te Pāti Māori were all hit repeatedly with the same message: WEF sellout. This is clearly a coordinated attack if it's happening over an entire region overnight. And as somebody who's in charge of organising billboards and cleanups and volunteers for a campaign, Holly has an interesting insight into this as well.
Actually can't tell you how many campaigns I've been involved with, but there's quite a lot. And this has definitely been one of the worst years in terms of signage damage. And it is daily damage in different places. We're confident it's the same group of people for a lot of it, not all of it, but certainly for a lot of it. There's very specific messaging that's going onto the billboards that gives us confidence it's the same group, as opposed to a bit of tagging or crossing out a face or, that kind of usual stuff that you expect. So yeah, we feel that we are confident there's a very coordinated effort going on, and I expect that's across the country to be disruptive in that way.
The right to protest is a cornerstone of any functioning democracy, but so too is the idea of having free and fair elections free of disruption. What we've seen in the last 3 years has been a ramping up, though, of rhetoric that causes people to be angry. It's called rage farming, and we're seeing it an awful lot in a really specific group. They have 8 different political parties running in that group this election, and they include figureheads like Liz Gunn, Brian Tamaki, and Leighton Baker. And they are there because they get people talking. They make sure that they're the center of attention. And at the same time, the messages that they're putting out there to people who are already disenfranchised, who are already susceptible to misinformation, can lead to all kinds of really terrible disruptions. And we've been lucky so far that the disruptions might be a Vision New Zealand candidate who stops and interrupts Chris or Chris as they do a stand-up. But we also need to remember things like Vision New Zealand is part of the Freedoms umbrella, which includes Rock the Vote NZ, who have actual policies against Māori and Māoridom. The Tamakis have worked with Julian Batchelor while he's out there spreading his anti-co-governance tour. Meanwhile, at the other end of the spectrum, you've got Te Pāti Māori cleaning off signs with the N-word printed on it. And it's all connected. It's all coordinated disruptions. In the last week, we've actually seen a neo-Nazi in Christchurch arrested for semi-automatic illegal weapons that he was sitting there saying, no, it's not such an issue. But at the same time, he was at the Wellington protest encouraging people to storm the building and to Nuremberg MPs. That's scary. In other parts of the world, we've seen the storming of the US Capitol. We've seen the murder of MPs. The disruptions for this campaign are coming really clearly from one really specific sector, and that's concerning. Because that sector, as I said, has 8 political parties in it at the moment. And these people need help because they're disenfranchised, and we should be listening because they're disenfranchised, but they don't know what they want, which leads to the disruptions. The best thing we can do at this point is make sure we're going to those meetings and keeping an eye on things, making sure that if we're interacting with politicians that people are safe, and making sure that if these people start to disrupt that they're put in their place. That's it for this week's episode. Thank you very much for listening. Join me again next week where we're going to talk a little bit more about disinformation in particular. Until then, I will catch you next time. Ka kite anō.